So we've been all month talking about justice, and not just like this political sense of justice, not just maybe even how we've encountered justice, but kind of like God's heart for justice. Now, this morning, we want to talk about more than just justice. We want to talk about some of the faces that we see in our everyday life. I'm not just talking about the faces on media or social media or print or whatever. I'm talking about the people that we walk by. And I've noticed something about the things we see in our everyday life. Is that the more common thing that you see going by you, the less it registers in your mind. Let me take it out of the people category for just a moment. Janine's birthday is my wife, Janine. It's her birthday today. Okay, so yeah. We're going to have a rousing rendition of Happy Birthday later on, and maybe even do sections where we do this loop. Not really. But part of her birthday gift to herself was to finish painting our house on the inside, okay? So if you've been over at our house, maybe you've seen some different shades of colors being thrown up on the wall. It's none of those colors. It's an entirely different color, okay? But she's doing a great job painting it. It's kind of fun to see it's different. And it's probably time. I mean, I put a lot of time into painting that a year ago, so it's like, it's probably time for a whole paint again anyway. So I did. I painted it a year ago, and the funny thing about that is there was 1 square foot on part of our kitchen, like the space above our cabinets in our kitchen, that I missed. Okay, I missed it. I didn't see it, but Janine didn't miss it. She saw it. And she kept reminding me about it. She was like, hey, when are you going to paint that spot in the kitchen? I'm like, what spot? It's like, that spot. I'm like, oh, I don't know how that got there. I don't know how I missed that. But, like if you've done a lot of painting of your house, you realize that to break out a brush and everything you need for 1 square foot, you might, that's the whole thing. Right? It's almost the same amount of work. I don't want to pull out a paintbrush and have to paint it and then clean up. The cleanup process is still just about the same for 1 square foot as it is for everything. So I'm like, listen, when we're ready to paint something else, then I'll deal with it. But I noticed something, as that just lingered there, I didn't even notice it anymore. It wasn't until I was going through this kind of assessment for pastoral ministry, believe it or not, mildly funny, I suppose. It was an ADHD screening, and he was like, have you ever left something undone? And I just tilted my screen up so you could see it. I'm like, you mean like that? He was like, that's exactly what I'm talking about. But the more I saw it, the more it just kind of became this visual background noise. You don't even notice it. It just kind of becomes common. It just becomes what is there. It no longer stands out as something that's unfinished or maybe even messed up. It's just how things are. Your brain doesn't even register it anymore. Now, when I think about the faces we see and the people around town, the same thing actually happens. We are surrounded by a community of people that has all sorts of stories going on behind, oftentimes, and I'm including ourselves in this, okay? I'm not pointing fingers at anybody else, including ourselves on this. There's like a facade, right? We kind of walk around with this front on, and if somebody gets to see behind, maybe we're a little bit embarrassed about what people get to see behind, but the more often you see that, the more it just kind of becomes commonplace, right? Until you don't even see it anymore. I want to share statistically a few things that I'm talking about. We've been looking up some statistics and demographics in Yakima, and one of the things that captured my attention, actually captured the attention of a good leadership group that we put together to kind of figure out what, again, God is asking for us over the next 5 years. Some of these statistics really stood out. First, we have just a couple of categories up here. There's number of families, and then there's divorced and never marrieds. Now, these are 3 different statistics about our community, specifically Yakima. And what really caught our attention is that over the next 5 years, the number of young children, okay, this is middle school on down, is projected to increase over the next 5 years. Okay? That's fun. Some of you are like, ooh, I don't know why you think that's cool, but that is probably kind of cool. So the number of kids is going to go up. Interestingly, the number of households, even though it's not listed up there, is also going to go up. The number of combined households in Yakima is going to go up over the next 5 years. Now, here's the other thing. the number of divorced and never marrieds is going to exponentially go up. Now, why does that make any difference? Like, what does that mean? What it means is as the number of households rise, as the number of kids rises, that means something. It means that while that number goes up, the number of never marrieds and divorce goes up, it means that there's going to be a whole lot more kids and households trying to provide love, nurture, and support for their families alone. That's what that means. If all of those things are going up, it means that there's more kids without the full support system around them. But as the faces go by, we just see faces. Right? They're just people that go by, and we don't really have an opportunity always to slow down and find out the story and see what's going on. And so when we came across this bit of information, this projection over the next 5 years, it's actually a little bit unsettling to me. Unsettling to the point where, like, along with the leadership of this church, we feel like that we have to do something. Like, we can't not do something. And that something has to come from a place inside of us. That something has to come from a place of conviction. It has to come from a place of empowerment that's probably even beyond ourselves. So I want to ask you to go with me to the book of James. If you have a Bible with you, you can go to it's not really a book, it's more of a letter written by a guy named James. If you don't have a Bible, it's going to be on the screen up above, or you can pull out the Bible app on your phone. You can even Google the passage if you want, James 1:22 through 27. You'll be able to follow along there. But like I said, it's going to be up here. Now, before we dive in, last week we read from an account of Jesus' life by a guy named Matthew. When we mentioned that Matthew was probably like a really unlikely person to be able to follow Jesus or be following Jesus, welcome to follow Jesus. By many accounts, he's like the wrong kind of person. He didn't have a good story. He didn't have integrity. He didn't have any of those things that you think people who are following Jesus probably have. Which just kind of shows you, like one of the things we talked about was Jesus didn't really choose people because of how good they were. That actually doesn't have any bearing on who he invites to follow him at all. Something similar about James. Now, we don't know 100% for sure, but church tradition actually suggests that the James that writes this letter is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, if you have siblings, maybe you have one of those siblings where your family and other people thought your sibling was just so perfect. Like they could walk on water. They thought the same thing about James's brother, right? They were like, this guy, you getting the joke, some of you, because there's a story where Jesus walked on water. Yeah, now, okay, there it is. So James is an unlikely person to be writing a letter to encourage people about following his brother because for the most part, throughout the stories that we read of Jesus, James didn't believe what his brother said about himself. Now, that's like we can, if you have a sibling, you get that. You're like, I never believed a single thing my sibling said. In fact, I'm pretty certain they wanted to hurt me, right? Now, James and Jesus didn't always get along. In fact, there's one moment where James is looking to go to Jerusalem for a festival, a religious Jewish festival, and he's like, Jesus, why don't you go there? And Jesus is like, if I go there, they're going to kill me. They're looking for a chance. He's like, Jesus, why don't you go there? Right? Like they didn't get along super well. James didn't really like his brother at first. He didn't believe Jesus was who he says he was, but now he does. Like something happened, and James started to believe that Jesus is who he says he is. And so he starts writing this book. If you read the first few verses, he describes himself as James, the servant of the Lord Jesus Christ. Right? Like his faith is full in. And then he writes he talks about who he's writing to. He talks that he's writing to the other followers of Jesus who are scattered all over the world. Now, James is writing like thousands of years ago, probably just 30-ish years maybe in that time frame after Jesus' death. So around 60 to maybe 80 AD, that's when this letter was written. And James is writing to other Christians who lived at that time who are living just all throughout everywhere. It wasn't to a specific region. It was wherever you are, this is for you. Now, I bet James didn't imagine that somebody thousands of years later would still be picking up a copy of his letter and learning from it. But we are. It's pretty incredible. So we're going to dive in. James chapter 1, verse 22. James writes this: "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongue deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world." Now, I like James, like I really do, to be able to kind of like swallow your pride and be like, okay, I get it. My brother he actually is special. Mom wasn't just like favoring him. Like anybody who could do that and then write a letter of encouragement about it, like they're all right, you know? Like that's somebody you want to pay attention to. And as he writes this, there's another reason I like him. And it's because I've always been a little bit action-oriented. Arguably too action-oriented to like, I don't even think things through, I just go for it. It's not always a great thing. Sometimes it is. But I lean toward action more than just talk. In fact, I get incredibly frustrated when we just talk and talk and talk and talk about things, but nothing ever happens. Ironically, that's kind of what's happening right now. I'm a talker. Right? That's what I do. That's part of my job. But I don't like just talk. I like action. I like things to happen. I think there's a lot of you that are action-oriented, and so maybe you're going to resonate with some of what James says as well, because he starts here by saying, don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says, right? Like James' main point in this whole letter is right there. He just like tipped his hand. He just revealed everything that he's about. He doesn't just want us to hear and believe something intellectually. He believes that if you believe something, it should work itself out in your life. There should be a both. It's not that hearing and understanding things is bad. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what James is saying. He's saying that if you truly believe something, if there's a value, if there's like a moral code inside your heart, then that should produce something through you. Okay? And James is going to be more specific about the kinds of things that he's talking about. But right now he just lays this out. He says, if any of you hears the word and does not do what it says, you deceive yourselves. If you only merely listen to the word. Now, what word is he talking about? The word that James is talking about, he refers to twice in this little passage that we read. He says the first way he says word, and then later on he's going to say the perfect law which brings freedom. He's talking about the same thing. The word that he's talking about is not necessarily the entirety of Scripture, although he would accept that as well. What James is talking about is the good news about his brother, the word that was spoken about Jesus. The word that was spoken about who Jesus is, that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus was somebody who lived a perfect life in a way that we cannot, somebody who died in our place, was resurrected back to life, ascended to the right hand of the Father, and sends the Spirit of power so that his church, his people, can do what Jesus did. That's the word. That is the word. So James says, if you hear that word, but only hear it, if you only listen to it. Now, the word listen that James is talking about is really that intellectual understanding. Like, if you just receive it intellectually, if all you do is hear it, but it doesn't produce anything in your life, you're deceiving yourself. Right? There's an action-oriented thing that James is calling us to. He says, in fact, you have to do what it says. As he continues writing, he says, anyone who listens to the word, there it is again, but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. So there's this analogy, and to be honest, I'm not sure why James uses this analogy. I don't think it's an amazing one, and I think we're allowed to say that. It's pretty basic, right? So James is living in a time when there were mirrors, like we have mirrors, and I don't think they were quite as shiny, and they certainly weren't as prevalent, but there were a lot of mirrors. Now, you can barely walk by cars and buildings without some kind of reflective surface in which to look at yourself. Okay, we have selfies, we have Instagram, we have all these social media things that continually remind us about what we look like. Okay, the opportunity is there. Now, for James, he looks at this reflective surface, and he says, if you hear the word, but don't do what it says, you're like somebody who looks at their reflection in a mirror, and then they walk away, and the very next moment after you walk away from that mirror, it's like forgetting what you just did. It's like forgetting what you look like. Now, the analogy that James is drawing out is somebody who does that is disconnected from reality. Right? They're disconnected from reality. They don't remember the very thing that they just took part of. And I don't think James is referring to somebody with short-term memory loss. I don't think James is dealing with somebody who has struggle in their mental faculties. James is talking about somebody who's disconnected from reality in a way that they can do one thing one moment and it doesn't impact the next. That's where James is going. He says, so if you can look at the word, if you can hear the word, if you can listen to it, that word about who Jesus is, but it doesn't do anything, you are like somebody who's disconnected from reality where one moment doesn't impact the next. Okay? He says, after looking at himself, he goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom, that's synonymous with the word about who Jesus is. He says anyone who forgets what they look like is like somebody who, or whoever looks intently into the perfect law, that gives freedom and continues in it. All right, that's the thing. Like you take part in this, you hear it, and then it produces some level of action in your life. You're not disconnected from reality. There's something different. He says the person who looks intently into the perfect law that brings freedom and continues in it, acts in light of it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed. That's the reason I like James. Not because he talks about blessing, like that's not where I'm going. I'm talking about James because he's like there's this integrity thing. Now, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, here's what I believe. I believe everybody has some kind of internal moral code that we live by. Okay, it might come from a different place. You might call it a set of values. You might not call it a moral code. You might call it a way that you operate or a list of rules. I don't know what you call it. Whatever you call it, there's something inside of you. And James is saying, listen, everybody lives from the inside out. If you have that kind of internal moral code, but you're not living in light of it, you're deceiving yourself. And here's why you're deceiving yourself. You're deceiving yourself because you're living unintegrally. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. Nobody wants to be known as an unintegral person. In fact, if that's a way that we live, we'll do just about anything we can to suppress that image or hide it from people. And that lack of integrity, that understanding about integrity is the dissonance, the place where what we're doing doesn't line up with what we say we believe. For James and for those who profess Jesus, those who confess that Jesus is the leader of their lives, he's saying that's a moral code. There's something in you that should change your actions. There's something happening in you that should affect the way you live. Now, one of the things that, we mentioned it briefly last week, but one of the things that bothers me more than anything that oftentimes the church is accused of, truthfully, is that we like to talk about how we're right, but it doesn't seem to affect our day-to-day. And who wants to be a part of a faith like that? Who wants to be a part of a religious system in which your beliefs don't actually change anything in the real world? Well, what's the point? What's the point? That's why I like James. James is saying that it should drastically change things. It shouldn't be some kind of a list of rules that you live out. There should be some kind of transformation. If Jesus is who he said he is, and if you accept that Jesus is who he said he is, then there should be a drastic change. And it'll happen slowly. It'll happen continuously and incrementally through your life, but it will happen. There should be something happening around you because of what you believe. And if it doesn't, James says we're deceiving ourselves. We're not lining up with what we say we believe. So that means something. It means we either don't believe what we said we believe, or we have to adapt our actions to what we believe. This is a big deal for James, so much so that scholar and Bible commentator Douglas Moo says this: the true test of any religious profession, James suggests James, is not the outward ritual of worship, which many go through unthinkingly with little heart and commitment. Now, what Professor Moo is actually saying is not that somebody's a professional religious person, but the religious profession that we have, that the thing we profess as true, the thing we hold to, that moral code, that witness, that thing we believe and agree with. He says the true test of any religious profession, suggests James, is not the outward ritual of worship, which many go through unthinkingly and with little heart commitment. No, the real litmus test of religion is obedience. Without it, religion is vain, empty, useless, and profitless. Now that includes Christianity. Any religious system. Now, I grew up hearing a mantra over and over and over. I think it was probably a bigger deal in the 80s and the 90s than maybe it even is today. But there was this thing the Christians would say a lot, where we would say, listen, I'm a Christian. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. Right? And it's a little bit cliche now. I actually still like it. I think there's some reality to it. And the reason is because religion has been such a dysfunctional thing, especially in our society at our time. Nobody really wants to align themselves with a religion because oftentimes what religion is aligned with is just a set of rules. And then we take that set of rules and we superimpose it on the world around us, and then we judge people whether they're living out our set of rules or not. Some of those rules, especially according to Douglas Moo, is just unthinkingly and with a little heart commitment participating in some ritual act of worship. Moo says that if our worship is just a ritual, then it is how we're thinking of religion. But when James talks about religion, and we're going to read a verse where he mentions religion in just a moment. When James is about to talk about religion, he's not talking about religion in the way that we talk about religion. He's actually talking about religion in a positive light. Because in his day, religion was not a negative term. It had positive connotations. And that's because virtually everybody participated in some spiritual, religious act of worship. They were sacrificing to idols, or they were participating in some kind of ritualistic worship. They all had religion. Virtually nobody was religionless. So for James, in what we're about to read, James didn't get down on religion. He actually wanted to talk about what true religion is, because everybody could understand that at some level you participate in religion. I think arguably James would say to us, all of us have some kind of religious understanding. It might not be Christianity. It might not even be a religious, spiritual worldview. Religious is the thing that keeps us connected to what we believe. That's where the word religion comes from. It comes from a word known as religio. It has to do with ligaments that connects you back to a body. So our religious practices are the very things that connect us back to a belief system. All of us are religious. Every single one of us is religious. So it actually matters when we read something like this. Those who consider themselves religious and do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Now, it seems like James is going from one thing, right, and he's like hopping all over the place. That's what it's going to feel like if we don't understand the common thread that's being woven through this. For James, the most important thing is about obedience. It's about integrity. It's about lining up with who we say we want to be, who we are becoming. Is that manifesting outside, externally in your life, or is it only something that you agree with? Now, James says that the most important way you can tell if somebody who thinks they're religious is actually living out what they believe is what comes out of their mouth. Now, where does he get that from? And we talked about James' past with his brother. And I'm sure he heard a lot of things his brother said. I'm sure he was tired of hearing a lot of things his brother said. But one of the things his brother Jesus said is this, that it's out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. That means what's on the inside will eventually come out through our mouths. That our mouth is actually just a reflection of what we truly believe. And as you know, especially for me, like the moments I'm tired, if a kid wakes me up in the middle of the night, I have the least control over the things I say. Okay, I'm the least nice. And I've had to start being like intentional about that. Like they wake me up and instead of saying, go back to bed, I have to say, they need love right now. Okay, how does that sound right now? And then I try to will my words to actually work coming out of my mouth. But there are moments where like the true things that are in our hearts will come out. And it's only a matter of time. Sometimes we're at our strongest, sometimes we're at our weakest, but eventually what comes out of our mouth, the things we say, are going to be a reflection of what's on the inside. And that goes across any religious boundaries. That goes across any levels of spirituality or worldview or understanding or philosophical differences. The things that come out of your mouth are a reflection of what's on the inside of your heart. And so James picks up on that understanding of his brother Jesus. And he says, here's the true test of real, true religion is what comes out of your mouth. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road for me as we're talking about justice. Janine and I we had just moved here not super long. We've lived here for just about 3.5 years. And we were going to one of the nicer restaurants in town. I don't know if it was for our anniversary or for a birthday or what. But we were sitting at a table, and next to us comes in a couple of guys. They sit at the table. And clearly one is not from town. He's pretty vocal about that. And as he's sitting there, his friend, who does live in Yakima, says, so what do you think? Pretty nice, huh? And his friend looks at him and he goes, I guess for Yakima. I tell you what, I got upset. Like, I'm not confrontational, but I was gearing up for some intense, and who do you think you are? Like, you don't get to talk that way about Yakima if you don't live in Yakima. Now, I didn't say that. Because here's also what I believe. Even if we live in Yakima, and especially, this is for you church folk, especially Christians, that reveals something about our heart toward the place we live. Here's where I think the rubber meets the road for justice issues in Yakima. How do you talk about Yakima? Because from what I can see is our lineage as faith people, from all the way since the earliest records we have of people who follow God, the God of the Bible, the earliest records we have is God says, you're actually supposed to be my reflection and my image in the world, and you're supposed to be a source of blessing, of my blessing to the world. So I think James would look at us and say, hey, you who consider yourself a faithful person in Yakima, how's your mouth doing? I don't think he's talking about cussing, right? Like, I'll be honest, and you can disagree with me on this. I don't care if you cuss. I really don't. All through growing up, people were like, oh, Dan's a Christian, don't cuss in from him. I'm like, I don't care, man. I'm going to confess tonight for the things I just said. I don't care. I don't think he's talking about those kind of words. I think he's talking about the heart that's behind any word we speak. Because it's from what's in here that needs to change. It's through the mouth that it's just a reflection of what's in there. So James says, listen, if you're considering yourself any sort of religious person, how's your mouth doing? Are we a source of blessing or are we a source of cursing for our city? That's justice issue kind of number one. Then he gets even more specific. So if all of this matters, if we're supposed to do what we say we're going to do, like how does that look as a follower of Jesus? If we receive the good news of Jesus, then what actually does matter? And here's where he gets even more specific. He says, listen, on this note of religion in verse 27, he says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. Like the best version of religion, the most pure version of religion that we can witness is this, he says, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, why the heck does James point out orphans and widows? Seems oddly specific. I think it's this. James is using orphans and widows in part, very specifically, like he does mean literal orphans and widows, but he's also pointing at a group of people in his time with the least amount of visibility in the community. He's looking at the people in the community that had the least amount of resources, the least amount of rights, the least amount of visibility in their community. See, orphans were somebody, and it didn't matter whether you were male or female. In James's time, an orphan was somebody who had nobody to care for them, and nobody in the government was going to care for them either. They were effectively a nobody. They didn't have any social status. They didn't have any rights. They couldn't contribute anything to society, so they did not matter. In fact, we have accounts of atrocious things happening to orphans because they didn't have anybody to protect them. They were used, they were abused physically, sexually, they were abused in any way, shape, and form you can possibly imagine because they did not matter. They were virtually unseen. They were an object to be used. They were helpless. They had no inheritance. They had nobody to redeem them. The ancient world was full of redeeming kinsmen. If you did something to somebody else's relative, they could redeem. They could get vengeance on you legally. They didn't have anybody like that. They were fair game. And widows weren't really that much different. In fact, in many ways, widows, because they were women, were actually seen as beneath kids. They were servants of kids. And a widow was somebody who had lost all of their rights and all of their protections, and legally they weren't able to do anything. They oftentimes didn't have money or resources. They weren't deserving of any legal protections. Their word didn't even hold up as a valid testimony in a court of law. It was effectively pointless to rely on a woman's word in that day and age. They were even seen beneath educating. As a side note, Jesus had some of his learners, some of his disciples were women. He was radical. Some of the earliest people in the church who did have resources, who did host places, they were women. In fact, I think sometimes in our culture we see history in the rearview mirror and we think, oh man, look at how the Bible puts down women. No, if you understand what was going on, it was radically progressive. They were given space to learn, they were given value, and they were given a place. They were given status in the church because this church was an equal space for everybody. Social status did not matter. And that's what James is picking up. He's picking up these orphans and these widows, the people who were unseen. Again, Douglas Moo says this about orphans and widows. The orphan and widow becomes types of those who find themselves helpless in the world. That's the bottom line. Orphans and widows were helpless in the world in every way you could imagine. But he says this, Christians whose religion is pure will, I need you to catch this, please. Christians whose religion is pure will imitate their Father, he's talking about God the Father, by intervening to help the helpless. Let's just pause there for a second. Where does Professor Douglas Moo even come up with this? Because Scripture says that while we were still sinners, in a sense, while we were still helpless, Christ died for us. The very good news of Jesus that James talks about is a powerful God coming down to a helpless people and intervening in a way that we could not handle on our own. That's what the church is being called to step into and say, you see that heart of God the Father? Be known for that. Imitate that. Reproduce that. Christians whose religion is pure will imitate their Father by intervening to help the helpless. Those who suffer from want in the third world, in the inner city, those who are unemployed and penniless, those who are inadequately represented in government or in law. These are the people who should see, not just hear about, see abundant evidence of Christians' pure religion. I love that Moo points out the seeing it. Because in my experience, and one of the places I get the most bitter about the church, it's okay if you're a little bit bitter about the church. Because we shouldn't be totally okay with something that is flawed. Flawed doesn't mean it should go away. Flawed means that those who make it up, that's us, should be aware and start working towards better. But one of my bitternesses with the church, one of the places I see us as flawed, is how much we just talk. We have a lot of people who are helpless in some kind of political or societal sense, that can't do what they need to do. They come from a place where they can't help themselves. And we'll just talk to them until they agree with us. James says that's only one part of it. Talking to be like agreeing with this good news, that's just one part of it. Are they seeing you? Are they seeing the love of Jesus? Do they have an experiential understanding of who Jesus is? Seeing, according to James, people seeing the love of God through us, through our church, through our living. That's the experience. That's the true understanding of real, pure religion, not just hearing about it. And James ends this whole section. He says, keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Why does he say that? James is not getting down on the world, actually. James is saying that he understands that living can only come from a deep, pure source. Right? Just like the mouth, it speaks in light of what we believe. Our living can only come from a life that's been radically transformed by the person of Jesus and is continually being transformed by Jesus. That's the idea. And when we start becoming that type of person, we're going to start noticing the people around us that we just drive by every day. We're going to start noticing the statistics in our city where kids are going to be increasingly growing up in families where they don't have the full support of an entire team. It's hard when Janine and I, or one of us goes out of town for travel. It's like single parenting taste just for a moment. And I don't even really mean that like super tongue in cheek. I mean like just for a moment, we get to see how difficult it is to run everything. Just a little bit of a taste. We just get to scratch the surface just for a moment. And it's hard. We start calling on friends. We're like, I can't do this for a day alone. I'm going to need some help. There's a whole city around us, the faces we see, that are increasingly going to be doing that on the regular without the support. For me, that's not okay. We have to do something. It's not enough just to understand. It's not enough to just see the statistics. If I had to like sum up everything that James is saying about religion and about faith, it's this. It being faith or religion or whatever you want to fill in the blank there, it doesn't matter if we see others if they don't see us. Not just hear us. If they don't see us, if they don't see some level of that being reflected into the world around us, then our faith is pointless. It doesn't matter to the everyday life. And I don't know about you, I'm not satisfied with any sort of moral code, religion, spirituality that doesn't affect the world around me. Because in my understanding, it means it doesn't matter. If it has no impact, it doesn't matter. If it can't be seen, it doesn't matter. But here's what I believe about Jesus. I believe it matters a great deal. I believe it's life-changing and life-altering. I think that regardless of who we are or what faith background we have to look at some of this information. We have to look at what James is saying. We have to look that people need to see the love of God, and we have to understand something. Just as James said that hearing and knowing isn't enough, we have to do something. And the more we learn about our community, then we have to understand this. Now we know. What will we do? Now we know the general story of the neighborhoods around us. What are we going to do? Here's the first thing I would ask us to do. And it really does have to do with seeing. I want to ask you to begin to see them. But I'm not talking about just knowing the statistics. I'm talking about actually seeing the faces of the people around us. And in order to see them, in order to really grasp what James is talking to us about the vulnerable population around us, I think we need to have a better understanding of what it means to see orphans and widows. Orphans and widows aren't just people who are living in an orphanage somewhere around the world. Orphans and widows exist just outside our door. Orphans and widows exist in this room. There's a wonderful organization that works to partner with nonprofits and faith organizations to meet the needs of widows and orphans, especially around the world, but even here in our own home. And I pulled a couple quotes from their website. The first one is about orphans. It says this: "Orphans are the children with no mother who are left locked at home because their dad or mom is working all day and has no money for childcare." Think about it. What is an orphan? It's somebody whose parents aren't present, and that doesn't have to be because of death. I think if some of us look back at our own story, we might even consider, maybe I was an orphan. Because my parents were around, but they didn't give me what I needed. Or they gave me the wrong thing. Even in those statistics, even with the statistics of the kids that are going to be growing up in this valley, there are going to be an increasing amount of orphans. And then they redefine, the same organization redefines the widows. And they say this: "The widows are the parents who need their children to work the fields or contribute in some way around the house." Okay, we could expand that. Work the fields with them so that they can scrape a living together and afford their next meal. He is the husband or wife whose spouse suffers from a debilitating chronic illness and is unable to work. There's a whole host of households that are going to be increasing over the next 5 years. And there's going to be individuals in marriages that are unsafe or unprovided for, and we don't see them because it just becomes background noise. They've been there for so long, we don't even register it anymore. We have to see them. And they might not look like the orphans and the widows that we expected them to look like, but you're still married, you still have somebody there. Yeah, but they're not able to provide, or they're not able to love me the way I need to be loved. That person is like a widow. And we can't just care about the people who are in those positions. We have to care about the people who might be in those positions. All of us come from some kind of a broken household story. There's brokenness in every single family at some level, and you and I live out the story that we picked up along the way. You and I have pieces and tastes of what it's like to live that kind of a lifestyle where we didn't get the nurture that we needed, and now we're living in light of that. We live out our wounds every single day, and we need to see those people that have been abandoned even if their parents were still in the home, but they chose to love something else more than nurturing their kids. Those are orphans, or they will be orphans. The spouse who decides, I don't love you anymore, leaves many people as a widow or a widower. I think God's calling this church to see them. Not just as a statistic, but to see them in a way where we're filled with compassion, where we're filled with the Father's heart and love for them, that we have to do something. We have to see them. Secondly, we have to identify the needs. Now, when Janine and I were in foster care, we fostered for about 6 years in Michigan. When we were in foster care, we were really actually proud of this. We were proud when we took our first placement and second and third, all these placements over the year. We were super proud of that. We liked being a part of what seemed like it should be a solution to a problem. But as we got talking, we noticed something. It was just meeting one of the needs in the foster care system. We would often say things like, listen, if every Christian in the church entered into the foster care system, there would be no more need for placements through DHS or any of the other foster care organizations. Every kid that needs a bed would have a bed if that happened. But then we realized something. We realized that maybe today that would be true, but what about tomorrow when another kid gets removed from their house? Because providing the beds, that's a need for the kid, but what about the parents? The parents who are living out their own orphan or widow story from their growing up, they have needs too. What about them? What could have been done in their story leading up to this so that the kids didn't have to get removed and the parents didn't suffer another blow to their heart? I think in the world around us, and I've even heard it in the churches, man, they're just getting what they deserve. Well, I thank God every time I don't get what I deserve. And so do you. They're not getting what they deserve. They're living out the story that's been done to them. And so we started thinking, like, what if those families that are now widows and orphans, what if those families had somebody to intervene for them when they were young? What if their story would be different? What if they had a support system that loved them and gave them what their family can't provide for them? That's justice. Remember, we said justice isn't about people being penalized. It's not about punishment. It's about restoration. That's justice. We have to identify the needs. And so here's my challenge that I'm asking from all of us today. Will you start looking, and will you start seeing, and then will you start finding out what the needs are? If you know somebody who's in that kind of a position where they're single parenting or where they're stressed that maybe they're going to be in that position, would you just be a little bit pressing in them? Would you ask them what their stressors are? I'm not saying this hypothetically, like we really want to know, because what we believe is God is asking us to enter into that work and enter into that pain as a church. And it's going to be really, really hard, but we need to know what their needs are, not just what we think their needs are. We want to know what causes them to be stressed. We want to know what the pressures are, because here's what I know. I know that parents who do horrific things to their kids, or kids who do horrific things to other people, aren't just living out their stories. They are living out the current stressors in their life. And maybe if we could find a way to wrap around them, we'd be able to relieve some of their stress so that they didn't seem to need to do those things. I think there's many spouses who are going to be widowed by substance abuse over the next 5 years. But nobody enters into substance abuse because they think it's going to be a swell time. We do it, all of us, at one level or another. It doesn't need to be a narcotic or alcohol. It could be anything that we numb with. We go there because we don't know how to cope with the stresses of our lives. What if we could start reducing some of the stressors of the lives of the people in this neighborhood? What if that started reflecting into how they treat their spouse or their kids? What if that started being reflected in the way their kids were able to learn and able to change the narrative or the trajectory that their family was on? What if we could do that? Will you help us find out what those needs are? Will you be bold and just start asking? Because we do want to help. Otherwise, our faith doesn't matter. There's going to be one more thing I want to ask us, and it's this: make room. I want to ask us to make room. I want to ask you to make room in your space, in your affections, in your mercy toward others. Yes, all of that. But also, as we've been reflecting on the needs of this community and this call toward orphans and widows today in our neighborhood, we feel like if we start stepping into that, we better actually make room in our building. Because what happens if you start caring for people and they start feeling loved by you? They start going where you go. It's just natural. You start building relationship, it happens. Right now, our facilities aren't set up for dealing with an influx of kids. I promise you a couple of things. We don't have a building that's safe enough to handle an influx of kids. We don't have a kids ministry team of volunteers that's big enough to handle an influx of kids. And we don't have a layout that will support a safe, nurturing environment for kids. And so what we're doing is just kind of phase one. And this is kind of information for a lot of you. We're switching up where our kids are going to be in the next 3 to 6 months. Right now, they're kind of split in 2 different locations. Even as a parent, when I drop my kids off in the basement, I think, it's a basement. Right? That might be a generational thing, but it's a basement. I don't put my kids in the basement. I'd love to be able to get to them in a moment if I need to. I want to know where they are. I don't want to get lost in a basement. So we started having some conversations with leadership and with staff. And we said, listen, if something's going to change, it has to change with us first. And so the staff is all giving up their office space so that we can renovate the back area and make it a wing for kids. Because we believe if we actually enter into somebody else's hurt, it's going to change things. We're not doing this as a church growth strategy. We're doing it because we have to do something. And we can't just go serve them. Last week we talked about A.B. Simpson, who was serving the poor with his church. And the church was good with it until the poor started coming to church with them. And they're like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And so he started a new church. We've got to start a new church. One that's not just satisfied with serving, one not just satisfied with seeing, not just satisfied with going, but inviting into our lives hospitably. Radical hospitality will change any wall we need to do for that. So there's a number of ways you can get in on this. You can serve in kids if that's your heart. We'd love to have you do that. But if you have a skill in trades where you can help us knock down some walls, reroute some electrical, and do some remodeling and carpet and drywall, we need you as well. And so if you want to write this down, if that's you, if you have that kind of a skill, I want you to email Megan. Megan@yakimachurch.org. Email her. Let her know, I do things with my hands that build. Like, let her know what skill or trade you have. Like, I can do electrical, I can do framing, I can do drywall, I can do... What do you do? Can you help? Can you help us make space for kids and vulnerable families here? Because we got to do something. And I believe if we start taking up all of this, we're going to experience a shift of changed trajectory and changed stories. So people don't live out the story of brokenness in their life, but they live out a justice story of God's restoration. That's the one I want to be a part of. Let's pray.